El Mencho was one of the most feared, powerful, and elusive cartel leaders in the world. Born Nemesio Ruben Oseguera Cervantes in a poor rural village in Michoacán, Mexico, he would rise from obscurity to lead the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, a criminal organization that became one of the most violent and influential drug trafficking groups on the planet. His early life was marked by hardship and struggle, growing up in poverty and dropping out of school at a young age. In the 1980s, he crossed into the United States in search of a better life, living in areas like the San Francisco Bay before being arrested on drug charges and deported back to Mexico. After returning to Mexico, Oseguera got involved in organized crime, working for the Milenio Cartel. As the organization fractured, he began building his own reputation for ruthlessness, first forming the Los Matazetas faction, and later transforming it into the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG. Under his leadership, the CJNG expanded rapidly, taking advantage of weakened rivals, forging alliances, and branching into international trafficking networks. El Mencho's rise was neither quiet nor subtle. The cartel he led became notorious for its brutality, leveraging advanced weaponry and an aggressive strategy that targeted rival groups, law enforcement, and anyone who stood in its way. Shootouts, blockades, and direct confrontations with Mexican military forces became commonplace in regions under CJNG influence. For years, Mexican and U.S. authorities pursued him relentlessly. Both governments placed massive bounties on his capture, with offers reaching millions of dollars for information leading to his arrest. The DEA and Mexican law enforcement agencies tracked his movements and investigated his vast network of operatives involved in trafficking cocaine, fentanyl, methamphetamine, and other drugs into the United States and beyond. Despite intensive manhunts, El Mencho proved extraordinarily elusive. He built a network of rural hideouts, led security details, and operatives believed to be trained in military tactics. Reports suggested that he employed former soldiers and highly trained gunmen, giving his organization a tactical edge in many engagements with law enforcement. Then, in February 2026, Mexican authorities launched a large-scale security operation aimed at capturing him. Intelligence gathered over weeks pointed to his location in a rural area of Tapalpa, in the western state of Jalisco, a region long associated with CJNG activity. The operation was led by Mexican federal forces, including the Army National Guard and other security units. With crucial intelligence support shared by U.S. agencies, an unprecedented level of cooperation between the two countries in the fight against cartel violence. On February 22, 2026, the raid began. Federal troops advanced on the location thought to be his hideout, triggering a fierce firefight with cartel gunmen. Heavy weapons and tactical equipment were used on both sides as the terrain around the compound became a battlefield. During the clash, multiple cartel members were killed and others wounded. El Mencho attempted to escape the engagement with members of his security detail, but he was critically injured in the effort. He was evacuated by helicopter and was being transported to receive medical care when he succumbed to his wounds. Also killed with him were several members of his inner circle. The news of his death spread quickly, but the response on the ground was explosive. As the Mexican army confirmed his death, waves of retaliatory violence erupted across Jalisco and other states. Vehicles were set on fire, roads were blocked with burning barricades, and shootouts broke out in major cities. The chaos was widespread enough to affect airports and travel, with flights cancelled and authorities issuing advisories for residents and tourists to stay indoors. The scale of the backlash revealed the depth of CJNG's influence. The cartel's network was not just regional but national, with reach into major economic centers and transportation routes. The violence that followed his death was marked by coordinated blockades and confrontations with security forces, leaving dozens dead, including cartel members, security personnel, and civilians caught in the crossfire. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum called for calm and increased security measures, but the environment remained tense. Schools were closed in some regions and public transportation faced disruptions as authorities tried to contain the unrest. Governments of the United States and Canada issued travel warnings for their citizens in Mexico, urging caution amid the escalating violence. Security analysts warned that El Mencho's death could lead to a power vacuum within the CJNG. With one of the cartel's top leaders gone, speculation rose about rival commanders or family members vying for control. Without a clear successor, internal conflict within the organization could lead to further violence and fragmentation. El Mencho's killing marked a historical moment in the Mexican drug war. He was one of the few cartel bosses in recent memory whose influence spanned continents, a figure whose cartel was linked to both domestic criminal networks and international trafficking routes. His ability to evade capture for years made his eventual fall a major victory for law enforcement, but it also highlighted the complexity and danger of confronting deeply entrenched criminal organizations. As the CJNG regrouped, authorities bolstered security across multiple states to prevent further chaos. Roadblocks were dismantled. Stranded travelers were assisted. Military checkpoints multiplied. The government emphasized that eliminating the leadership did not mean the end of the cartel's operations, but rather a new, uncertain phase in Mexico's battle against organized crime. For families of victims affected by cartel violence, El Mencho's death was a moment of mixed emotions. Relief that one of the most notorious figures in Mexico's drug war was gone, but fear of what would come next as criminal networks recalibrated their strategies and influence. Across borders, reactions were swift. U.S. officials hailed the operation as a significant achievement in the fight against cross-border drug trafficking, emphasizing the role of international cooperation in dismantling criminal networks that fuel addiction and violence in multiple countries. Yet experts warned that the elimination of a single leader, even one as powerful as El Mencho, rarely ends the underlying issues that give rise to cartels. Distribution networks, corruption, community complicity, and economic inequality all continue to feed the drug trade. Removing a kingpin may disrupt operations temporarily, but history has shown that new leaders emerge, conflicts shift, and the cycle persists. The 2026 operation against El Mencho will be studied for years as a pivotal moment in Mexico's struggle with organized crime. It demonstrated both the reach of modern military operations and the unpredictable ripple effects of decapitating a major criminal enterprise. As the country continues to grapple with cartel influence, one question remains at the forefront: what comes after El Mencho? In the hours after confirmation of El Mencho's death, the country moved into a state of controlled alert. Security forces reinforced highways, city entrances, and rural corridors long used by the cartel to move weapons and personnel. Military convoys established checkpoints along routes connecting Jalisco to neighboring states, while surveillance units tracked communications believed to be tied to CJNG commanders coordinating retaliatory acts. The sudden vacuum left by the cartel's leader did not bring quiet. It triggered motion. Lieutenants attempted to assert control over territories that had long operated under El Mencho's direct authority, and rival groups tested CJNG positions to see where leadership had weakened. The result was a tense recalibration of criminal power that rippled through regions dependent on the cartel's logistical networks for drugs, extortion, and protection rackets. Communities accustomed to the cartel's presence braced for instability, knowing that leadership transitions in organized crime rarely happen without bloodshed. Inside the CJNG structure, command had never been purely symbolic. El Mencho maintained tight control over operations, discipline, and retaliation policy, and his removal disrupted chains of authority that had been enforced through fear and loyalty. Regional commanders faced immediate pressure to demonstrate strength to prevent defections. Some factions moved to secure revenue streams from drug corridors, ports, and laboratories, while others focused on neutralizing internal threats. The absence of a singular authority increased the risk of fragmentation, a process that historically leads to internecine conflict, splinter groups, and unpredictable violence as former allies become competitors. For law enforcement, this fragmentation created both opportunity and danger, as disorganized networks are more vulnerable to disruption but also more likely to lash out in chaotic ways. The operational footprint of CJNG extended far beyond rural hideouts. Urban safehouses, logistics hubs near ports, financial conduits for laundering proceeds, and cross-border corridors for drug movement all depended on coordinated leadership. With El Mencho gone, these systems did not collapse overnight, but friction increased. Communications slowed as intermediaries sought confirmation of new hierarchies. Orders were questioned. Payments stalled. The friction exposed vulnerabilities that authorities sought to exploit through targeted arrests and seizures. Yet the cartel's redundancy meant that many operations continued autonomously, guided by established routines that had been drilled into cells for years. This resilience underscored a central reality of organized crime. Removing a leader disrupts direction, but entrenched systems persist unless dismantled at multiple levels. Public reaction oscillated between relief and dread. For communities scarred by CJNG violence, the death of the cartel's leader represented a symbolic victory against a figure who had come to embody impunity. For others, it signaled an approaching storm. Businesses closed early in high-risk areas, families limited travel, and local authorities issued advisories urging caution. The social atmosphere tightened, shaped by the memory of previous flare-ups when power vacuums had turned cities into battlegrounds overnight. Internationally, The consequences of El Mencho's death extended along trafficking routes that fed demand far beyond Mexico's borders. Disruptions in supply chains affected drug markets in the United States and beyond, creating temporary shortages that historically drive price spikes and competition among distributors. Such disruptions also tend to provoke rapid reconfiguration of routes, with smugglers testing new corridors to bypass intensified enforcement. This adaptation cycle is fast and iterative, reflecting how transnational criminal networks absorb shocks and reorient. Law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border increase cooperation to exploit the moment, targeting transport cells, money couriers, and storage facilities that might be exposed during the reorganization phase. Within Mexico's prison system, the aftermath carried implications as well. CJNG influence had long extended into detention facilities through intimidation, bribery, and the coordination of operations from behind bars. With leadership disrupted on the outside, incarcerated members faced uncertainty about protection and direction. In some facilities, rival groups sensed weakness and sought to assert dominance over extortion rings and contraband pipelines. Prison authorities prepared for potential unrest, aware that shifts in cartel leadership often echo within walls where power balances are fragile. The prison environment, already strained by overcrowding and limited resources, became another arena where the consequences of El Mencho's death could manifest. The narrative of victory surrounding the operation risked oversimplifying the complexity of what followed. While the removal of a cartel leader can weaken centralized command, it also decentralizes violence. Smaller cells, less constrained by a single strategic vision, may pursue aggressive tactics to prove relevance or secure territory. This decentralization complicates policing, as threats become less predictable and more dispersed. It also increases the likelihood of civilian harm, as fragmented groups lack the discipline that centralized leadership sometimes enforces to avoid unwanted attention. The cycle of fragmentation and consolidation is a recurring pattern in organized crime, and El Mencho's death inserted CJNG into this turbulent phase. For the communities that had lived under CJNG's shadow, the shift was felt in subtle ways. Some extortion collectors failed to appear, while others increased demands to compensate for uncertainty. Checkpoints that had once been controlled by cartel lookouts disappeared in some areas and multiplied in others. The absence of a singular command produced uneven enforcement of criminal rules, leaving civilians unsure which lines were now dangerous to cross. This uncertainty eroded whatever fragile predictability had existed under the previous order, replacing it with a volatile landscape where miscalculations could turn deadly. The broader political implications were equally complex. Government officials emphasized the operation as evidence that sustained pressure and intelligence coordination could neutralize even the most elusive targets. Critics countered that leader-focused strategies, while symbolically powerful, do not dismantle the economic and social conditions that sustain cartels. Both views contain truth. The operation demonstrated capacity and resolve, but it did not resolve the structural drivers of organized crime: demand for drugs, economic inequality, corruption, and limited legitimate opportunities in regions where cartels recruit. Without parallel investment in these areas, enforcement victories risk becoming temporary disruptions rather than durable change. As the CJNG adjusted to life without El Mencho, the organization's internal culture faced a reckoning. Loyalty forged through fear and patronage required renewal under new leadership. Commanders who rose to prominence had to prove they could provide protection, revenue, and direction. Those who failed risked defection, assassination, or marginalization. This internal competition generated instability that law enforcement sought to exploit by isolating emerging leaders before they could consolidate power. The contest between state pressure and criminal adaptation unfolded rapidly, with each move provoking countermoves in a dynamic struggle over control of territory and markets. Across Mexico, the story of El Mencho's death became a reference point in the ongoing narrative of the drug war. It illustrated the reach of state power and the limits of kingpin strategies. It reminded communities of the cyclical nature of cartel violence and the uneasy calm that follows major disruptions. And it reframed CJNG not as a monolithic entity anchored to a single figure, but as a network capable of absorbing loss and reconfiguring under pressure. The consequences of this moment were still unfolding, shaping the trajectories of violence, enforcement, and survival in regions long caught between criminal power and state authority. As authorities intensified pressure on CJNG after the death of its leader, the cartel's internal dynamics shifted in ways that exposed how deeply institutionalized its operations had become. Regional commanders who once answered to a single authority began asserting autonomy, not because the structure encouraged independence, but because uncertainty demanded it. Control over ports, manufacturing sites, and distribution corridors became contested, and the competition to secure these assets generated sudden bursts of violence in areas that had previously remained stable under centralized command. In some regions, rival organizations tested CJNG defenses, probing for weaknesses left by disrupted communication lines and fractured leadership. These tests were not symbolic. They were tactical moves designed to capture routes, recruits, and revenue streams before new leadership could consolidate power. The resulting instability reshaped daily life for civilians who lived along trafficking corridors, where the presence of armed groups intensified and checkpoints appeared and disappeared without warning. Financial networks tied to CJNG also faced disruption. Laundering operations that moved proceeds through shell companies, cash-intensive businesses, and cross-border transfers experienced delays as intermediaries sought confirmation of authority. This slowdown created opportunities for law enforcement to intercept funds and map connections that had previously been concealed by disciplined operational security. Yet the adaptability of these networks meant that alternative channels emerged quickly, often using smaller transactions and more decentralized couriers to avoid detection. This shift toward fragmentation complicated enforcement, as the volume of transactions increased even as their individual size decreased, creating noise that masked criminal activity within legitimate economic flows. The symbolic impact of the leader's death reverberated through recruitment pipelines as well. For years, the cartel's narrative of invincibility had attracted young recruits seeking status, income, and protection. The publicized operation that ended the leader's life punctured this myth, introducing doubt into a culture that thrived on the perception of untouchability. Some recruits hesitated, questioning whether loyalty would still guarantee security. Others doubled down, interpreting the event as a call to prove resilience through retaliation and expansion. This divergence created internal tension between factions favoring caution and those advocating aggressive posturing to reassert dominance. Within communities under CJNG influence, everyday interactions shifted subtly. Extortion collectors altered schedules to avoid targeted arrests. Lookouts changed positions and communication methods. Civilians who had learned to navigate informal rules under centralized command found those rules suddenly unreliable. The predictability that had allowed some semblance of normal life under criminal control dissolved, replaced by a volatile environment where misunderstandings carried higher risk. Businesses faced renewed pressure to demonstrate loyalty to whichever faction appeared strongest on a given week, while residents limited movement after dark, anticipating flare-ups triggered by territorial disputes. Law enforcement strategy adapted in response to this volatility. Rather than focusing solely on high-value targets, authorities pursued network disruption, aiming to sever connections between production, transport, and finance. This approach sought to exploit the friction introduced by leadership change, targeting mid-level operators whose removal could cascade through decentralized cells. However, the scale of the network meant that each successful operation addressed only a fragment of the system. The persistence of demand for illicit drugs ensured that new actors stepped into vacated roles, maintaining the flow of goods even as individual nodes were removed. Cross-border dynamics intensified as well. Trafficking routes feeding external markets experienced temporary disruption, prompting smugglers to reroute shipments through less monitored corridors. This rerouting placed new communities along emerging routes under pressure, exposing populations previously untouched by direct cartel activity to intimidation and violence. Border enforcement agencies adjusted patrol patterns, but the adaptability of smuggling operations meant that enforcement gains were often localized and short-lived. The interplay between disruption and adaptation underscored how transnational criminal systems absorb shocks without collapsing, redistributing risk across geographies rather than eliminating it. Media coverage of the leader's death shaped public perception of the broader conflict. Headlines framed the operation as a decisive blow, creating expectations of immediate improvement in security. When violence persisted, public frustration grew, fueled by the mismatch between symbolic victory and lived reality. This gap highlighted a recurring challenge in narratives of organized crime enforcement. The removal of prominent figures produces visible moments of triumph, while the structural conditions that sustain criminal economies change slowly and unevenly. Public patience wanes in the absence of rapid improvement, complicating political support for long-term strategies that prioritize institutional reform over headline-grabbing arrests. The cultural imprint of the cartel's leadership extended beyond operations into identity and myth-making. Stories of ruthlessness and survival circulated within criminal circles, shaping how emerging leaders framed their authority. With the original figure gone, narrative splintered, each faction crafting its own version of legitimacy. Some invoked continuity, claiming lineage to the previous command. Others emphasized innovation, presenting themselves as architects of a more aggressive or more discreet future. These narratives influence recruitment, discipline, and strategy, demonstrating how power in organized crime is sustained not only through violence and money but through stories that justify hierarchy and loyalty. The ripple effects reached into regions where the cartel had established social influence through selective philanthropy and coercive governance. In some communities, criminal groups had funded local events, mediated disputes, or provided limited economic opportunities, creating a fragile dependency that blurred lines between fear and accommodation. Leadership change disrupted these arrangements, as new commanders reprioritized resources towards security and revenue protection. Community members who had relied on these informal systems found themselves exposed to instability without the protections, however flawed, that had previously existed. This erosion of informal order increased vulnerability and resentment, complicating relationships between residents and both criminal groups and state authorities. As the months following the operation unfolded, the pattern of violence shifted from centralized displays to dispersed incidents. Rather than coordinated nationwide responses, clashes emerged in clusters tied to contested corridors and leadership disputes. This dispersion challenged traditional metrics of success in the fight against organized crime. While large-scale spectacles diminished, localized violence intensified, making the conflict less visible in national headlines but more acute in affected communities. The uneven distribution of risk underscored the importance of regional strategies tailored to specific dynamics rather than uniform national approaches that overlook localized pressures. The broader lesson of this period lay in the limits of decapitation strategies when not paired with sustained institutional strengthening. Removing a leader disrupts command, but it also unleashes competition that can heighten volatility. Durable reductions in violence require parallel investment in judicial capacity, anti-corruption measures, economic alternatives for at-risk populations, and cross-border cooperation targeting financial flows. Without these elements, enforcement victories remain episodic, punctuating a longer cycle of adaptation that criminal networks navigate with experience and resources. This phase of recalibration following the leader's death illustrated the resilience of organized crime ecosystems. They are not singular hierarchies but layered networks capable of absorbing loss by redistributing authority, rerouting logistics, and reshaping narratives of legitimacy. The immediate aftermath revealed cracks in coordination, but it also demonstrated how quickly new equilibria form under pressure. The struggle between state disruption and criminal adaptation continued, reshaping territories, alliances, and the everyday realities of communities caught within the shifting balance of power. As the post-leadership phase unfolded, intelligence agencies began to map how authority within the organization was redistributing across regions. Patterns emerged showing that areas once tightly controlled by centralized command were now governed by overlapping spheres of influence. This overlap increased friction, as multiple commanders attempted to extract revenue from the same routes and communities. The result was not only conflict between criminal factions but also increased pressure on civilians who were caught between competing demands. In towns along trafficking corridors, residents reported fluctuating rules, sudden curfews imposed by armed groups, and unpredictable enforcement of extortion payments. The erosion of a single chain of command replaced one form of criminal order with a volatile contest for dominance, amplifying uncertainty for those living within these contested spaces. Law enforcement adapted by shifting focus toward disrupting connective tissue rather than pursuing symbolic targets alone. Financial intelligence units tracked changes in payment patterns, identifying newly active intermediaries and shell companies that appeared after leadership fragmentation. These shifts created windows of vulnerability, as inexperienced operators made operational errors that exposed networks to surveillance. Arrests of mid-level coordinators yielded insights into how authority was being reconstituted, revealing a patchwork of alliances forming across regions. Yet each disruption also forced criminal groups to evolve, adopting more compartmentalized structures designed to limit damage from infiltration. This iterative cycle of exposure and adaptation underscored how deeply embedded criminal networks had become within logistical, financial, and social systems. The flow of illicit substances responded quickly to leadership disruption. Production sites adjusted schedules to avoid detection during periods of heightened enforcement, while distribution cells experimented with smaller, more frequent shipments to reduce losses from seizures. This shift increased the burden on communities near manufacturing hubs, where the presence of armed guards intensified to protect assets during uncertain transitions. Residents in these areas experienced heightened surveillance by criminal groups, as leaders sought to prevent leaks and defections. Fear became a method of maintaining continuity when formal authority was unstable, reinforcing patterns of coercion that had long defined the organization's relationship with local populations. Within the organization's internal culture, narratives evolved to rationalize the new reality. Some commanders framed the leader's death as proof that the organization must become more decentralized to survive, promoting operational autonomy as a strength rather than a vulnerability. Others emphasized continuity, insisting that the core mission and code of conduct remained unchanged despite leadership loss. These competing narratives shaped recruitment messaging, with some factions promising recruits greater independence and opportunity, while others stressed loyalty to tradition and hierarchy. The tension between decentralization and cohesion influenced how violence was deployed, with autonomous cells more likely to pursue aggressive tactics to secure territory and resources in the absence of unified restraint. Cross-border enforcement efforts intensified during this period of flux. Agencies coordinated to exploit inconsistencies in smuggling routes, deploying surveillance to corridors newly favored by traffickers attempting to evade increased scrutiny on established paths. These adaptations displaced risk geographically, bringing criminal activity into areas previously peripheral to trafficking networks. Communities along these emerging routes faced sudden exposure to violence and intimidation, while local authorities struggled to respond with limited resources. The expansion of routes demonstrated how enforcement pressure in one region often redistributes harm rather than eliminating it, complicating the pursuit of durable reductions in organized crime activity. The economic dimensions of disruption became increasingly visible. Illicit profits underwrite not only violence but also influence, bribery, and social penetration. As financial flows experienced friction during leadership transition, competition for revenue intensified. This competition manifested in aggressive collection tactics, with extortion rings increasing demands to compensate for uncertainty in larger shipments. Businesses faced renewed pressure to demonstrate compliance, and those perceived as unreliable were targeted to set examples. The resulting climate of intimidation reinforced the cartel's grip on local economies, even as internal instability threatened coherence at higher levels of command. Political responses navigated a delicate balance between signaling strength and managing expectations. Public messaging emphasized resolve and cooperation, highlighting arrests and seizures as evidence of progress. However, the persistence of localized violence strained public confidence, revealing the limits of episodic enforcement victories. Community trust eroded in areas where protection was inconsistent, and residents grew skeptical of claims that leadership decapitation alone could bring lasting safety. This skepticism underscored the importance of coupling enforcement with visible improvements in local security, judicial access, and economic opportunity, without which public support for long-term strategies weakens. Within detention facilities, shifts in external leadership altered internal power balances. Incarcerated members affiliated with the organization faced uncertainty regarding protection and privileges previously secured through external command. Rival groups attempted to capitalize on perceived weakness, leading to heightened tensions within facilities where overcrowding and resource scarcity already strained order. Authorities implemented precautionary measures to prevent coordinated unrest, recognizing that instability outside can reverberate inside confinement. These dynamics highlighted the interconnectedness of criminal power across environments, where changes in leadership on the outside can recalibrate hierarchies behind bars, influencing contraband flows and patterns of intimidation within institutions. The informational environment also shifted as narratives competed for dominance. Social media amplified rumors, exaggerations, and strategic messaging aimed at projecting strength or sowing fear. Criminal factions circulated videos and statements to assert continuity, while authorities countered with evidence of disruption. This contest over perception influenced recruitment and morale on both sides, demonstrating that modern organized crime operates not only through physical control of territory but also through narrative control in digital spaces. The rapid spread of information accelerated cycles of reaction, compressing timelines for adaptation and response. Over time, patterns of leadership succession began to stabilize, though not without cost. New figures emerged with varying approaches to governance and violence, each shaping regional dynamics differently. Some prioritized consolidation and reduced visibility to avoid provoking intensified enforcement, while others pursued aggressive expansion to establish legitimacy through force. These divergent strategies produced uneven levels of violence across regions, complicating national assessments of security trends. Aggregate statistics masked localized surges, making it difficult to communicate the lived reality of communities experiencing intensified pressure. The broader lesson of this phase lay in the systemic nature of organized crime. Leadership change alters trajectories, but entrenched incentives and infrastructures persist. Supply chains, financial conduits, and recruitment pathways adapt to leadership turnover, absorbing shocks through reconfiguration. Effective disruption therefore requires sustained pressure across multiple layers of the network, coupled with institutional reforms that address corruption, judicial capacity, and economic vulnerability. Without these parallel efforts, periods of fragmentation give way to renewed consolidation under new leadership, perpetuating cycles of instability that reverberate through communities and across borders. As the organization adjusted to life without its central figure, internal enforcement mechanisms became more brutal and less predictable. Where authority had once flowed through a recognized chain of command, it now moved through shifting alliances enforced by fear. Commanders relied more heavily on displays of violence to secure loyalty, using targeted punishment to deter defection and signal control. This escalation did not stabilize the network. It destabilized daily life in regions where these power struggles unfolded. Civilians experienced abrupt changes in who controlled territory, with checkpoints appearing overnight and disappearing days later, each change accompanied by new rules, new demands, and new risks. The erosion of a single governing hand replaced a rigid order with fragmented coercion, amplifying the volatility of everyday interactions in cartel-influenced communities. Operational security practices evolved in response to heightened surveillance. Cells adopted stricter compartmentalization, reducing knowledge sharing between units to limit damage if individuals were captured. Communication shifted towards short-lived channels and rotating couriers, increasing operational friction but reducing exposure to long-term monitoring. These changes slowed coordination across regions, contributing to inconsistent enforcement of policies and uneven revenue collection. In practice, this meant that some corridors saw lapses in control that rivals exploited, while others experienced intensified crackdowns as local commanders attempted to compensate for uncertainty by exerting tighter control over movement and commerce. The ripple effects extended to labor dynamics within the criminal economy. This professionalization of certain functions coexisted with accelerated recruitment of young foot soldiers to bolster territorial presence. The combination produced a bifurcated structure where technical cells pursued discretion while street-level units pursued visibility through force, creating internal tensions over strategy and risk tolerance. These tensions manifested in contradictory behaviors, with some regions attempting to lower their profile while others escalated confrontations to project dominance. Supply chain resilience remained a defining feature. Production sites adjusted to fluctuating enforcement pressure by decentralizing manufacturing and rotating locations more frequently. This increased the footprint of activity across rural areas, bringing new communities into proximity with criminal operations. Residents in these areas encountered sudden security measures imposed by armed groups, including restrictions on movement and communication intended to protect clandestine facilities. The spread of production sites diffused risk for the organization but expanded the social impact of criminal activity, widening the circle of communities affected by intimidation and violence. Financial flows adapted to leadership disruption by diversifying laundering methods. Traditional cash-intensive businesses remained in use, but digital intermediaries and informal transfer systems grew in prominence as networks sought to obscure transaction trails. This diversification complicated financial investigations, as illicit proceeds blended into broader economic currents with greater ease. The proliferation of smaller, decentralized laundering channels reduced the vulnerability of the network to single-point failures, reinforcing the system's capacity to absorb enforcement pressure through redundancy. The intersection between organized crime and local governance became more pronounced in this period of instability. In areas where criminal groups exerted influence over municipal officials through coercion or bribery, leadership changes altered the balance of obligations. Some officials faced renewed pressure to demonstrate loyalty to emerging commanders, while others attempted to distance themselves amid intensified scrutiny. This recalibration created governance gaps that affected service provision and security, leaving residents uncertain about where to seek protection or recourse. The erosion of trust in formal institutions, already strained by years of criminal influence, deepened as communities navigated overlapping authorities with competing claims to legitimacy. Cross-border networks adjusted their risk calculus in response to disruptions. Smuggling routes diversified, with traffickers favoring modular pathways that could be activated or abandoned quickly as enforcement patterns shifted. This modularity increased resilience but also expanded the geographic footprint of illicit activity, exposing new transit communities to collateral risks. Border enforcement agencies faced the challenge of responding to a moving target, as resources deployed to one corridor prompted rapid migration of routes elsewhere. The result was a continual redistribution of pressure rather than its elimination, underscoring the systemic nature of transnational trafficking networks. Information warfare intensified as factions competed to shape perceptions of strength and continuity. Propaganda circulated through encrypted channels and public-facing platforms, projecting narratives of resilience intended to deter rivals and reassure affiliates. Authorities countered with targeted disclosures highlighting arrests and seizures to undermine claims of continuity. This contest over narrative influenced recruitment and morale, illustrating how contemporary criminal organizations operate within a hybrid battlespace that blends physical control with psychological influence. The speed at which narratives traveled compressed response times, forcing both sides to react rapidly to shifts in perception as well as shifts on the ground. Within detention environments, the reverberations of leadership change continued to alter internal equilibria. Incarcerated affiliates recalibrated allegiances as external patrons shifted, affecting contraband flows and protection arrangements. Authorities increased monitoring of communications to detect coordination between inside and outside networks, recognizing that prisons can function as nodes in broader criminal systems. This heightened scrutiny disrupted some channels but also incentivized the development of more covert methods of communication, reinforcing the adaptive cycle between enforcement and evasion. Over time, emergent leadership patterns began to crystallize, though consolidation remained uneven across regions. Some commanders favored low-profile consolidation to stabilize revenue and avoid provoking heightened enforcement, while others pursued aggressive territorial expansion to demonstrate authority. These divergent strategies produced patchwork outcomes, with localized reductions in visibility offset by spikes in violence elsewhere. National-level assessments struggled to capture these nuances, as aggregate trends obscured regional volatility that defined lived experience in affected communities. The continuing evolution of the organization in the wake of leadership loss highlighted the limits of singular interventions. Disruptions created windows of opportunity, but durable change depended on sustained pressure across financial, logistical, and governance dimensions. Absent coordinated efforts to strengthen institutions, reduce corruption, and expand economic alternatives in high-risk regions, cycles of fragmentation and reconsolidation persisted. The system adapted, redistributed risk, and reasserted influence through new configurations, perpetuating a dynamic struggle that reshaped territories, alliances, and the everyday realities of those living within the shifting balance of power. As months passed after the fall of the cartel central figure, patterns of power slowly hardened into new structures. The early chaos of fragmentation gave way to a quieter consolidation as emerging leaders absorbed rivals, negotiated boundaries, and stabilized revenue flows. Violence did not disappear, but it shifted from overt displays toward targeted enforcement designed to maintain order within redefined territories. This transition reflected a familiar cycle in organized crime, where periods of instability are followed by new equilibria shaped by those capable of imposing discipline, coordinating logistics, and sustaining financial pipelines under sustained pressure. Communities that had endured the immediate shock of leadership disruption began to adjust to the new normal. Informal rules governing movement and commerce re-emerged, though often harsher and less predictable than before. Residents learned which routes to avoid, which businesses had become targets, and which hours were safest for travel. This normalization of threat underscored the tragic resilience of criminal governance in regions where state capacity remained uneven. Even as enforcement efforts persisted, the lived reality for civilians remained shaped by accommodation and risk management, rather than the restoration of full security. Institutional responses evolved alongside these shifts. Law enforcement agencies refined intelligence sharing protocols, integrating financial tracking with territorial mapping to identify emerging nodes of authority. This network-focused approach aimed to disrupt consolidation before it could solidify into durable hierarchies. However, the pace of adaptation on both sides meant that gains were incremental. Each successful intervention prompted adjustments in tactics, reinforcing a dynamic equilibrium in which neither side achieved decisive advantage for long. The contest became less about decisive victories and more about managing cycles of disruption and reconfiguration. The international dimension of the conflict remained central. Trafficking routes continued to mutate in response to enforcement pressure, redistributing harm across borders and exposing new transit communities to criminal activity. Cooperative frameworks between countries expanded, but coordination challenges persisted due to jurisdictional boundaries, legal constraints, and uneven resources. These constraints highlighted the difficulty of confronting transnational networks with institutions designed primarily for national enforcement. The mismatch between the scale of criminal systems and the scope of governance mechanisms remained a structural vulnerability that organized crime continued to exploit. Within the organization, cultural norms adapted to the post-leadership reality. Loyalty became more transactional, anchored in immediate benefits and protection rather than allegiance to a singular figure. This shift altered recruitment dynamics, attracting individuals motivated by short-term gain rather than long-term affiliation. The resulting churn increased operational volatility, as less embedded recruits proved more prone to error and defection. While this volatility created openings for enforcement, it also increased the risk of indiscriminate violence as inexperienced actors navigated contested environments without established restraints. Economic pressures continued to shape behavior at every level of the network. Fluctuations in supply and revenue influenced decisions about risk tolerance, with shortages prompting more aggressive competition for corridors and clients. These pressures cascaded through the system, affecting how resources were allocated between security, logistics, and recruitment. The interplay between market forces and enforcement pressure revealed organized crime as an adaptive enterprise that responds to incentives and constraints, recalibrating strategies to preserve profitability under changing conditions. Public discourse around the leader's death evolved as the immediate shock receded. Initial narratives of decisive victory gave way to more sober assessments acknowledging the persistence of structural drivers. Communities affected by ongoing violence expressed fatigue with cycles of disruption that failed to deliver sustained safety. This fatigue underscored the importance of coupling enforcement with visible improvements in governance, economic opportunity, and social services to build public confidence in alternatives to criminal authority. Without such investments, enforcement gains risked being perceived as transient, reinforcing cynicism about the possibility of durable change. The long-term trajectory of the organization's evolution illustrated the limits of person-centered strategies. While removing a central figure disrupted command and created short-term instability, the network's capacity to reconstitute under pressure demonstrated the depth of its institutionalization. Supply chains, financial conduits, recruitment pathways, and narrative frameworks adapted to leadership turnover, preserving core functions even as personnel changed. This resilience suggested that sustainable disruption requires comprehensive strategies targeting the ecosystem of organized crime rather than isolated individuals within it. As new leadership structures solidified, the conflict entered a quieter phase marked by less spectacle but continued coercion. The absence of dramatic blockades and public confrontations did not signify peace. It reflected a recalibration toward lower visibility control designed to reduce enforcement attention while maintaining dominance. For affected communities, this quieter phase brought no relief from the underlying dynamics of intimidation and extraction that had long defined life under criminal influence. The normalization of threat remained, embedded in routines shaped by caution and constrained choice. The broader implications of this period extended beyond any single organization. It offered a case study in how transnational criminal networks absorb shocks, redistribute risk, and persist through cycles of disruption and consolidation. It highlighted the necessity of sustained, multi-layered strategies that integrate enforcement with institutional reform and economic development. And it underscored the human cost of these cycles, borne disproportionately by communities situated along the fault lines of trafficking corridors and contested territories. The story of this transition did not end with the fall of a leader. It continued in the daily negotiations of safety, authority, and survival that defined life in the shadow of organized crime.